A disabled man crawled across a wooden porch in Duluth, clutching his father's old box as a stolen car vanished into the cold morning. An FBI agent arrived too late to catch them, but her German Shepherd froze at one blue thread. That single thread led to a garage, a hidden list, and a Navy SEAL brother racing home. No one knew why the robbers chose him. If you believe God still sends loyal paws to protect the forgotten, leave amen. Duluth, Minnesota woke under a bright kind of cold, the kind that made every rooftop shine as if the morning had polished it by hand. A thin silver mist floated over Lake Superior, softening the line between water and sky, while the old cedar houses along the shore still carried the damp breath of night. Caleb Hale moved slowly up the gravel drive toward his small lakeside home, one hand gripping the worn handle of his crutch, the other holding a brown paper envelope tucked inside his coat. He was 38, broad through the shoulders in the way of a man who had once worked hard with his body, with sandy brown hair cut short, a square jaw softened by tired eyes, and a limp that had become part of his shadow after a boatyard accident changed the rhythm of his life. Caleb did not like the word helpless. He did not even like help very much. His younger brother, Ethan, had offered money more than once, but Caleb had refused it with the stubborn dignity of a man who would rather patch his own roof badly than let love feel like pity. The money in the envelope was not much. It was enough for shingles, nails, and a local handyman who owed Caleb a favor from years ago. Inside the pocket of Caleb's coat rested something worth more to him than the cash, a small wooden box dark with age carved by his father's hands. In it was an old boatyard badge and a faded photograph of two brothers standing beside a dock. One boy tall and protective, the other skinny and fierce, both pretending not to be cold. Caleb had taken it to the bank that morning because he had stopped by the safe deposit box, telling himself it was only practical. The truth was softer. Some mornings, a man needed to hold proof that he had belonged to someone. He reached the garage door and pressed the remote. The old door groaned upward, slow and cranky. The same way Caleb said he felt before coffee. He almost smiled. Then a car door clicked behind him. The sound was small, but it did not belong to the lake, the gulls, or the wind. Caleb turned halfway, the crutch scraping against wet boards. Two young men were coming up the drive. One was tall and thin in a gray hoodie, his face narrow and restless. The other was shorter, heavy-set, with a red knit cap pulled low and eyes that kept jumping from Caleb's hands to the open garage. A third figure waited near a dark compact car at the curb. Engine running, head turned away as if pretending not to exist. "Morning," Caleb said, because in small towns a man sometimes greeted trouble before admitting it was trouble. The tall one did not answer. He reached for the envelope. Caleb pulled back. The movement was awkward but not weak. "No," he said. That one word surprised them. Maybe they had expected pleading. Maybe they had chosen him because of the crutch, the quiet house, the lonely driveway. The heavy-set one shoved past him toward the garage, and Caleb swung the crutch sideways, not gracefully, not heroically, but with every ounce of old boatyard defiance left in him. The envelope fell. The wooden box slipped halfway from his coat. Caleb grabbed it before it hit the boards. The tall one lunged again. Caleb stumbled backward onto the porch. His bad leg buckled, and the crutch clattered hard across the wooden planks. The sound cracked through the bright morning like a snapped branch in a silent church, and for one breath even the lake seemed to pause. 3 miles away, Special Agent Claire Whitaker heard the dispatcher's voice break through the radio inside her FBI SUV. Claire was 30. Slender but strong, with cool fair skin, chestnut brown hair pinned low at the nape of her neck, and blue-gray eyes that had learned to notice what louder people missed. She was not new to the Bureau, but she was new to this. Her first official case with Ronan as a certified K-9 team. Ronan sat in the back, a 4-year-old sable German Shepherd, with a dark mask, amber-brown eyes, and the solemn expression of a judge who had already read the room and found most humans lacking. He was calm by nature, careful with children, suspicious of closed doors, and deeply offended by squirrels who behaved without discipline. They had been driving to interview another victim from the same follow. Home robbery pattern, when the 911 call redirected them. A neighbor had heard a crash, then a weak cry from Caleb Hale's address. Claire turned the wheel before the dispatcher finished. Her jaw tightened, not with panic, but with the quiet pressure of knowing this was the first true test. Beside her, Ronan rose from his seat, ears forward. When the SUV rolled near Caleb's property, Ronan gave one low sound in his throat. Not a bark. A warning. Claire parked short of the driveway and stepped out. A faint smell reached Ronan before it reached her. Damp wool, engine oil, cold metal, and fear. He pulled toward the side fence instead of the front walk. "Ronan," Claire whispered, "show me." The dog moved with controlled urgency along the fence line, nose low, paws silent over wet grass. Claire followed, one hand near her holster, the other steady on the leash. Through the side gap she saw Caleb on the porch, one hand clenched around the wooden box, his face pale with pain but his eyes still awake. The heavy-set robber was inside the garage, tossing open drawers. The tall one had turned back toward Caleb, reaching for the box. "FBI," Claire called, voice firm enough to cut the air. "Step away from him now." The tall robber froze. For 1 second he looked less like a villain than a frightened boy who had followed the wrong road too far. Then Ronan stepped in front of Caleb. The German shepherd did not lunge wildly. He planted himself, shoulders square, teeth showing just enough to make the message clear. The robber dropped the box as if it had burned him and ran. The one in the garage bolted after him. The car at the curb jerked forward, tires spitting gravel. Claire did not chase. She marked the vehicle. Dark compact, rear bumper dented, paper plate partly covered, heading north toward the old service road. Then she was beside Caleb. "Stay with me," she said, kneeling between him and the wind. "Look at me. Ronan is here. You are not alone anymore." Caleb tried to breathe through the pain. His hand moved toward the wooden box. Ronan lowered his head and nudged it closer with extraordinary gentleness. "Good dog," Caleb whispered, voice rough. "Better manners than most people." Claire almost smiled, but her eyes were already scanning. Near the garage frame, Ronan found a small piece of blue wool caught on a splinter, and a torn glove finger darkened with engine oil. Claire bagged them both before the ambulance arrived. At the hospital, Caleb drifted in and out of weary clarity. He was weakened, bruised by the morning, but still himself enough to tell the nurse that at least the roof had not leaked on him during the excitement. Claire stood near the doorway, careful not to crowd him. Ronan waited in the hall with official patience, though his eyes remained fixed on Caleb's room. Then Claire noticed the photograph on Caleb's bedside table, rescued from the wooden box, 2 brothers on a dock. The younger one had grown into a man she knew. Ethan Hale, 32, Navy SEAL, dark blonde hair, lean angular face, light stubble, and a steady guardedness that came from years of entering places most people prayed never to see. Claire had met him once during a joint training course. He had spoken little, listened sharply, and remembered every exit in every room. She called him from the hospital corridor. Ethan answered on the 3rd ring. Behind his voice was the hollow echo of a training facility somewhere far from Minnesota. Claire gave the facts clearly. Caleb was alive. He was safe for now. The case was active. For a long moment, Ethan said nothing. Then his voice came through low and stripped bare. "I'm coming home." Claire looked through the glass at Caleb, then down at Ronan, who sat beside her like a quiet oath. "I'll stay at the hospital until you get here," she said. It sounded professional. It was professional, but her hand tightened once around Ronan's leash, and the dog looked up at her as if he understood the small tremor hidden inside the words. Far away, Ethan stood in a concrete hallway with his phone still glowing in his hand. Wind moved across the training yard outside, cold and restless. He opened the old photo of Caleb on his screen, looked at it once, and walked away without looking back. In Duluth, Ronan lay down outside Caleb's room, ears raised, guarding the man fate had placed at his paws. Ethan Hale reached Duluth before the sun had fully climbed over Lake Superior. The airport was small, quiet, and pale with morning light, the kind of place where coffee smelled stronger than jet fuel, and every tired traveler looked like they had been carried in by the wind. Ethan moved through it without wasted motion. A 32-year-old Navy SEAL with dark blonde hair cut close, light stubble along a sharp jaw, and eyes the color of winter steel. He wore a dark field jacket over plain clothes, but the military never really left his shoulders. It lived there in the way he stood, in the way he noticed exits, in the way silence seemed to gather around him before he spoke. Yet when he stepped into the hospital hallway and saw Caleb through the half-open door, all that discipline folded inward. For 1 second, he was not a SEAL. He was only a younger brother seeing the man who had once carried him through snowdrifts, now lying under a thin hospital blanket. Caleb Hale looked smaller in the bed, though not defeated. His sandy brown hair was flattened on one side, his square face pale from a long night, and his damaged leg rested under the blanket, with the stiff patience of something that had endured too much attention already. The scratched crutch leaned beside the bed like an old soldier who had also been through trouble. Caleb opened one eye when Ethan entered and managed a crooked smile. "I told you, that roof was the real emergency. It has been threatening me for years." Ethan stopped at the foot of the bed, carrying a paper bag from the cafeteria. He looked at his brother, then at the machines, then at the crutch, as if his mind wanted to take inventory of every harm and correct it by force of will. "I brought soup," he said. Caleb peered into the bag and frowned. "Celery?" Ethan's face barely changed. It was the only one they had. "You cross oceans, jump out of aircraft, and still forget I do not eat celery." The nurse near the curtain, a round-faced woman named Janice Bell with warm brown skin, silver-threaded black curls, and the practiced cheer of someone who had seen fear enter too many rooms, smiled into her chart, and wisely said nothing. Ethan set the soup aside like evidence that had failed inspection. He pulled a chair close but did not sit. A disabled man crawled across a wooden porch in Duluth. Of course he noticed. Caleb had raised him after their father's long workdays at the boatyard, and after their mother faded from the house like music played too quietly to keep. "Sit down, Ethan. You are making the room nervous." Ethan obeyed. The chair creaked under him. For a moment neither brother spoke. Outside the window, Duluth moved gently under the morning. Cars hissing over wet pavement, gulls turning above the hospital roof, a slice of blue lake shining beyond the buildings. Caleb looked toward the door. "Where is the dog?" "The K9?" Ethan asked. "The gentleman with the fur coat and better manners than my attackers." Ethan's mouth almost moved into a smile. "Hallway good, I trust him already." Claire Whitaker stood outside that hallway with Ronan at her side, giving the brothers the privacy grief often needed but rarely asked for. Claire looked composed in her dark FBI jacket, chestnut hair tied low, eyes steady despite a night with almost no sleep. Ronan sat beside her like a carved guardian, a sable German shepherd with a dark muzzle, amber-brown eyes, and the calm expression of a creature who understood that waiting could also be work. Every few seconds, his ears shifted toward Caleb's room. He had not forgotten the man on the porch. Dogs, Claire sometimes thought, kept promises without needing language, which made them better than many people and nearly all committee meetings. Ethan came out 10 minutes later. He had regained his posture, but not entirely his face. Claire handed him a black coffee from the vending area before he could ask. He looked at it. "No sugar." "No sugar," she said. "If I remember right." He studied her for a second, and something passed between them that was not quite a smile and not quite memory, but close enough to warm the air by one small degree. "You do remember." Claire took her own coffee. "You remember more than your face admits." He looked down the hall, where Ronan watched him with solemn suspicion. "Does he always judge people this early?" "Only when they deserve a preliminary review." They walked to a quieter corner near a window overlooking the parking lot. Claire kept her voice low and factual because facts were safer than fear. Caleb had not been chosen by accident. He had withdrawn cash that morning. He drove alone. His garage sat partly hidden from the road. His mobility made him look vulnerable to someone cruel enough to measure human worth by speed. Ethan listened without interrupting, but the tendon in his jaw worked once. Then again. "I can find them," he said. "No," Claire replied. "You can help me understand Caleb, the town, and the places these men might use. But if you go after them alone, you risk damaging the case. Worse, you could draw them back toward your brother." Ethan's eyes hardened. Not at her, but at the truth. Ronan rose and stepped closer to Claire. Not threatening, simply present. The dog looked at Ethan with a strange stillness, as if reminding him that strength was not always a forward motion. Ethan breathed out slowly. Then tell me where to stand. From Caleb's room came the sudden metallic tap of the crutch slipping against the bed rail, sharp as a bell in the clean hospital air, and all three of them turned at once. Claire, Ethan, and Ronan. Held for one breath by the same fear before Nurse Janice called, "He is all right." That tiny sound changed the pace of the morning. It reminded them that the case was not a file, not a pattern on a board, not a list of offenses. It was Caleb trying to reach a cup of water with a body that had already been asked to be brave too many times. Claire returned to work with a quieter urgency. By late morning, she and Agent Nolan Pierce had set up in a borrowed conference room at the Duluth field office. Nolan was 44, tall and broad with close-cropped black hair, a weathered face, and the patient severity of a man who trusted procedure, because procedure had saved him from chaos more than once. He did not dislike Claire, but he was not sentimental about new K-9 teams. He wanted proof. Claire intended to give him proof without making a speech about it. They spread the recent cases across the table. An elderly woman whose purse had been taken near her garage after a church bake sale. A retired dock worker who lost a cash envelope after visiting the bank. A widower followed home from a small jewelry repair shop. The details were not grand. That was what made them frightening. Ordinary errands had become doors through which fear entered. Each victim had carried cash or something valuable. Each had been followed home. Each incident happened near a garage, porch, side entrance, or half-hidden driveway. The suspected car changed color in witness statements, but the shape stayed similar, a compact vehicle, likely stolen, with a damaged rear bumper. And at two locations, officers had noted a faint smell of engine oil on discarded fabric or gloves. Ronan's job was narrow and important. Claire did not ask him to solve the case like a storybook miracle. She let him compare scent from the blue wool recovered at Caleb's garage with items bagged from an earlier scene. When Ronan lowered his nose to the evidence cloth, inhaled once, then sat with his eyes locked on Claire, Nolan leaned forward despite himself. "Same source?" Claire said. "Same wool, same detergent trace, same damp storage smell. Close enough to matter." Nolan grunted, which, from him, was practically a hymn. The trail led them to a white clapboard church near the lake, where several victims, including Caleb, had attended a fundraiser during the last 2 weeks. The church sat under bare-limbed maples, bright against the northern sky, with a small fellowship hall smelling faintly of coffee, cinnamon, and furniture polish. An elderly volunteer named Mabel Trout greeted them at the door. She was 76, soft around the middle, with white hair pinned in a bun, pink cheeks, and the fearless hospitality of a woman who believed baked goods could improve almost any investigation. She remembered Caleb. She remembered the retired dock worker. She remembered a young woman who helped people carry bags to their cars. "Thin girl," Mabel said, lowering her voice. "Brown hair, pale as candle wax, always wearing a blue scarf." Lena Voss, sweet but jumpy, like a bird that has heard too many windows close. They saw Lena near the side hallway a few minutes later. She was 19, narrow, shouldered, with straight brown hair tucked behind her ears, fair skin marked by sleepless shadows, and a long blue knitted scarf wrapped twice around her throat. She carried a box of folded tablecloths, but when she saw Claire's FBI jacket, the box tilted in her hands. Her eyes found Ethan first, perhaps because grief has its own uniform. The color drained from her face. She did not run, not exactly. She stepped backward, then turned through a side door with the quick, frightened movement of someone who had been waiting for consequences to arrive. Ethan started forward. Claire stopped him with one quiet word. "No." He looked at her, anger and worry fighting behind his eyes. "She knows something." Claire watched the side door settle back into place. "Yes," she said, "but fear talks differently when it is cornered." Ronan walked to the center aisle of the fellowship hall and sat down, staring toward the door where Lena had vanished. His ears remained raised. On a coat hook near the wall, almost hidden beneath a gray cardigan, Claire saw it, a single blue thread caught on a rough edge of wood, small enough for most people to miss, bright enough now to feel like a sign. Ethan stood behind her, voice low. "She knows something." Claire carefully lifted the thread into an evidence sleeve and looked toward the side door. "No," she said softly. "She is afraid of something." By the third morning, the case had stopped feeling like a row of separate misfortunes and had begun to show its bones. Claire Whitaker stood in a small borrowed room at the Duluth field office, one hand resting on the back of a chair, her eyes moving from photo to photo across the evidence board. Caleb Hale's porch, Mrs. Alden's garage, the side entrance behind the jewelry repair shop, a bank parking lot caught on grainy camera footage. Each place looked ordinary, almost too ordinary, as if trouble had chosen the quietest corners, because quiet corners did not know how to scream. Ronan sat at Claire's left boot, his sable coat brushed clean, his dark muzzle tilted toward the table where sealed evidence bags rested in neat rows. The German shepherd had the patient stillness of an old monk and the eyebrows of a disappointed school principal, especially whenever Agent Nolan Pierce touched the evidence board with a donut crumb on his sleeve. Nolan, tall and broad in his navy jacket, tapped one photo with a pen. Samey type of vehicle in 2 cases, maybe 3. He had a practical face, strong nose, close cropped black hair, and the manner of a man who trusted facts more than hope. Claire did not mind that. Facts were loyal when handled properly. On the monitor, Paw's security footage from North Shore Community Bank showed a compact older Kia sliding through the lot behind Caleb's truck. Its rear bumper had a crescent-shaped dent, and the rear plate was partly covered by a torn paper frame. In another clip, 2 days earlier, a similar car waited near a church parking lot, while an elderly woman carried a donation envelope to her sedan. "They are not choosing houses," Claire said. "They are choosing the moment after people feel safe." Nolan looked at her. Bank, church, jewelry shop, then home, and always a garage, porch, or side door. Somewhere private enough to frighten them, public enough to escape fast. Ethan Hale stood near the window, arms folded tight, jaw shadowed with a night of little sleep. He had not been allowed inside as an investigator, and Claire had made that clear before the day started. He was there as Caleb's brother, and as someone who knew the old roads, boatyards, service lanes, and half-forgotten garages that did not always appear correctly on a federal map. The rule bothered him. It lived in his shoulders like an itch. A SEAL was trained to move toward danger, not stand politely beside a radiator, while other people discussed the men who had frightened his brother. But Ethan had listened. That was something. He looked at the bank footage again. "That road runs past Hammer Bay Repair," he said, "then splits by the Pines. One way goes toward the highway. The other goes behind 3 old garages. Nobody uses much anymore." Claire turned. "One of them Wesley Crane's," Ethan nodded once. The name had come from an auto parts clerk named Darrell Pike. A thin man in his 50s with a gray ponytail, yellowed fingers from years of cigarettes, and the nervous kindness of someone who had once made bad choices and now tried to be useful before anyone asked too many questions. Darrell told Nolan that a dented Kia had been seen near Wesley Crane's garage twice in the last month. Wesley, according to Darrell, was the sort of man who knew how to make an old car pass inspection, make a missing part appear, and make a person feel foolish for asking where it came from. He also fixed church vans for free and donated tools to a youth program, which gave him the warm public glow of a man who had learned that generosity could be used as a porch light while darker things moved in the shed. Wesley Crane's garage sat on the edge of Duluth where the road narrowed and the pines leaned close, their branches black, green against the pale sky. The building was low and weathered, with a hand-painted sign, 2 rusted snowplows, and a row of tired vehicles lined up like old horses waiting for one more winter. Wesley himself came out wiping his hands on a rag. He was 46, medium height, thick through the middle, with iron-gray hair combed back from a broad forehead, a trimmed beard that made his smile look more trustworthy than his eyes, and a voice smooth enough to sell a cracked engine as character. "Agents," he said, spreading his hands. "Wish you were here for better reasons." His eyes flicked to Ethan, then softened in a way Claire did not believe. "How's Caleb? Whole town feels terrible about what happened." "He is recovering," Claire said. "We are asking local shops about a compact Kia with rear damage." Wesley shook his head slowly, making sorrow look rehearsed. "Lots of old Kias around here. Folks keep them running long after the Lord and the manufacturer both give up." He chuckled gently, the kind of joke meant to make everyone accept him as harmless. Ronan did not. The German shepherd stood beside Claire, calm but alert. When Wesley bent toward a large red tool chest near the wall, Ronan stepped half a pace forward, placing his body between Claire and Wesley's hand. He did not bark. He did not bare his teeth. He simply became a door that would not open. Wesley paused. "That dog does not like me much." "Ronan likes clarity," Claire said. A socket wrench slipped somewhere inside the garage and struck the concrete with a bright, ringing snap. The sound flashed through the oily air, and Ronan's ears shot forward as every human in the room went briefly still. From that sudden pause, Claire noticed what the noise had revealed. Wesley's right hand had moved toward the tool chest, not away from the sound. A man startled by a dropped wrench usually looked at the floor. Wesley looked at storage. Claire marked it without changing her face. No warrant meant no opening drawers, no searching chests, no touching what the law did not yet allow her to touch. Procedure could feel like a locked gate when truth stood smiling on the other side. But Claire had learned that cases were not won by impatience. They were won by returning with the right key outside. Ethan stayed near the vehicles as instructed. That alone cost him something. Near the back fence, he saw a covered boat under a torn tarp. The shape tugged at a memory. He lifted the edge just enough to see the faded blue stripe along the hull. "That boat belonged to Frank Lasky," he said when Claire came out. Frank Lasky was a retired neighbor of Caleb's, a wiry widower who still wore suspenders and claimed weather reports were written by pessimists. He reported parts missing last winter. Caleb helped him file the claim. Claire looked from the boat to the garage. Wesley had smiled like a church donor while stolen parts sat behind his fence. A simple kind of ugliness. Maybe the kind that hid best because it did not need a grand speech. They did not move on Wesley that afternoon. They set quiet surveillance. Nolan disliked waiting but approved of warrants more than hunches. Claire sent the plate fragments to be checked, requested camera pulls from nearby roads, and logged Ronan's reaction to the tool chest as behavioral observation. Not evidence. By evening, the case had grown heavier without getting larger. It remained a plain crime: stolen cars, frightened victims, quick robberies, hidden property, possibly unlawful firearms. Yet beneath it, Claire felt the human pattern. The thieves were not only taking things, they were studying loneliness. They were learning who returned home without witnesses. At dusk, Claire, Ethan, Nolan, and Ronan stopped at Mariner's Table, a diner near the water where the windows fogged from coffee steam and the pie case glowed like a small shrine. The owner, Ruthie Gannon, was a short, lively woman in her late 60s with red-dyed hair, freckled hands, and a laugh that sounded like silverware in a warm kitchen. She recognized Ethan before he sat down. "Little Hale boy," she said, hands on hips. "You grew into a serious-looking lamppost." Ethan blinked, and for the first time all day, Claire saw his guard crack. "Hello, Ruthie. Do not hello me. You and Caleb used to eat pancakes here like wolves in winter." Ronan settled under the table with military dignity, though his amber eyes followed a slice of blueberry pie as if it were a suspect attempting escape. Claire pretended not to notice. Ethan's phone buzzed. He answered, and Caleb's voice came through faint but clear enough for those nearby to hear. "Stop looking at everybody like they are a tactical problem." Ethan leaned back. "I am not. You absolutely are. I can feel it from this hospital bed." Claire looked into her coffee and smiled before she could stop herself. Ethan saw it, and something softened in his face. When the call ended, a quiet rested between them. Nolan went to pay. Ruthie argued with him about whether federal agents should be allowed to tip badly. Ronan sighed under the table, still denied pie. Ethan looked at Claire. "Do you always trust him that much?" he asked, nodding toward the dog. Claire watched Ronan's ears twitch at the word him. "No, I just learned not to ignore him." Ethan's gaze stayed on her a moment longer than ordinary conversation required. "I understand that feeling," he said. "It could have meant instinct. It could have meant memory. It could have meant her." Claire did not ask. Her phone vibrated before either of them could move away from the silence. "Unknown number, 1 message." Claire read it once. Then again, "I did not know they would hurt Caleb. I only said he had money for the roof." Her hand stilled over the screen. Lena outside the diner window, old snow melted under passing tires, shining yellow in the streetlight. Ethan leaned close enough to read his brother's name, and the muscles in his hand tightened around the edge of the table. Claire placed one finger lightly on the wood between them, not touching him, not stopping him. Just a small, quiet line drawn before anger could become a road. Ronan lifted his head from beneath the table and looked at them both, silent as a guardian at the gate of whatever came next. The fourth morning came with a pale sun and a wind that moved gently through the bare maples behind the white church. The building looked peaceful from the road, its clapboard walls bright against the blue northern sky, its steeple pointing upward like a quiet finger of faith. Behind it sat a small storage room attached to the fellowship hall, where folding chairs, donated coats, paper tablecloths, and boxes of canned soup waited for the next charity drive. Claire chose that place for the meeting because it was open enough to feel safe, but private enough for a frightened girl to speak, without feeling displayed like a stain on clean linen. Agent Nolan Pierce stood near the back lot, broad and watchful, pretending to study his phone, while actually watching every car that slowed near the church. Ethan Hale stayed farther away beneath a leafless maple, his dark jacket zipped to his throat, his hard soldier's posture held in check by Claire's order. He did not like standing back. It showed in the set of his jaw, but this time he did it anyway. Lena Voss arrived 5 minutes late, and she looked as if those 5 minutes had cost her dearly. She was 19, narrow, shouldered, and thin in a way that made her blue scarf look too heavy for her neck. Her straight brown hair had been pulled into a loose ponytail, though several strands had escaped around her pale face. Her eyes were soft hazel, red-rimmed from a night without sleep, and they kept moving to the parking lot, the church door, the windows, the ground, anywhere but Claire's face. She carried no purse, only a cracked phone clutched in both hands. Claire noticed the hands first, not because they were guilty hands, because they were trembling hands. There was a difference, and Claire had learned to respect that difference. Ronan sat beside Claire, with his leash loose. The 4-year-old sable German shepherd did not push forward. He lowered his head slightly, ears relaxed, amber eyes steady. He had faced loud men, dark garages, and the sharp smell of fear. But with Lena, he became something quieter. Not less strong, just gentle enough for a wounded heart to approach. Lena saw him and froze. "Is he going to?" She did not finish. "No," Claire said. "He is just listening." Lena swallowed. "Dogs do that?" Claire looked down at Ronan. "The good ones do." For a moment, nobody spoke. A delivery truck rattled past on the road beyond the church, and Lena flinched so hard, Nolan looked up from the parking lot. Claire did not rush her. Fear, when cornered, either bit or disappeared. Claire wanted the truth, not a confession torn loose by panic. "You texted me," she said. "You said you did not know Caleb would be hurt." Lena's face tightened at Caleb's name. "I helped him carry shingles once," she whispered. "Last fall." He dropped a receipt outside the fellowship hall, and I picked it up. He made some joke about his roof having more personality than common sense. Her mouth trembled. "He was nice to me." "Then tell me what happened." Lena's eyes filled, but she did not let tears fall at first. She held them like punishment. Her boyfriend, Trevor Mills, was 21. Lean, quick-tempered, with a sharp nose, restless hands, and a smile that came easily when he wanted something. He had grown up bouncing between relatives, always angry at doors that opened for other people. And not for him. Lena said Trevor had started asking small questions after church events. Who had cash? Who lived alone? Who needed help carrying bags? At first he told her it was only to collect old debts. Then later that they would scare people, take a little, and leave. I know that sounds stupid, Lena said, looking at the floor, but when somebody you love keeps saying something is not that serious, and you already feel like you owe them for staying, sometimes your mind gets tired. Claire's expression stayed calm, but not soft enough to be mistaken for forgiveness. Your information helped them choose Caleb. I know. Lena pressed one hand over her mouth. I did not know they would go inside. I did not know they had firearms. I swear I did not know until after the second robbery. Then Wesley said, if I talked, he would say I planned it. He said no one would believe me over him. She looked toward the garage across town, though it was miles away. Everybody likes Wesley. Claire already knew that. Wesley Crane had built himself out of useful favors and cheap repairs, the kind of man who could hide behind 1,000 small thanks. Yes, Lena went on. There were 4 young men doing the follow. Holmes, Trevor, was one. Another had a prior felony and was not supposed to possess any firearm. Wesley kept the stolen items at the garage only briefly, then moved them through a small storage room behind the church or into vehicles heading toward the North Shore. She had seen 2 guns in Wesley's office, one with no serial number, one wrapped in a towel that Trevor said had been reported stolen in another county. The word gun seemed to shrink Lena when she said it. Then Ronan's nose twitched, and a low whine slipped from his throat as a cold draft pushed under the storage room door carrying the faint scent of engine oil, damp wool, and lake water. Lena stopped speaking, and the whole room seemed to lean toward that smell. Claire looked at Ronan, then at Lena. Has Wesley used this room recently? Lena nodded, frightened by the dog's reaction. Last night, maybe before dawn. I was not here, but Trevor texted me. He said the church was clean now. Nolan, hearing the change in Claire's voice, stepped closer from the lot. Claire did not waste a word. The statement from Lena, the blue wool, the vehicle footage, Ronan's scent confirmation, and the prior evidence from Caleb's property were enough to push the next step. She called for a warrant request on Wesley's garage and the church storage area, careful and precise, because a clean case was a case that could survive daylight. While Claire worked the legal path, Ethan went back to the hospital. Caleb was awake, propped against pillows, his face still pale but his spirit stubbornly sitting upright even if his body could not. Ethan tried to fix the zipper on Caleb's jacket, which had caught halfway. Caleb slapped his hand away with the weak irritation of an older brother who refused to be managed. I am disabled, not a museum statue needing polish. Ethan froze, then lowered his hand. I know. Caleb studied him for a long moment. The joke faded, but not the warmth beneath it. You say that like you are still learning it. Ethan looked toward the window. Maybe I am. Caleb's eyes sharpened, the way they used to when Ethan came home from school pretending nothing had happened. That agent, Caleb said. Claire. Ethan's face closed a fraction. What about her? She looked at you like she had already seen you make a bad decision, and was tired in advance. Ethan said. There is nothing. Caleb gave a dry little laugh. Men who say there is nothing usually have a whole winter sitting in their chest. Ethan did not answer. Outside the room, a nurse rolled a cart past, and somewhere down the hall, Ronan's absence felt oddly noticeable, as if the building had misplaced its guardian. By late afternoon, the warrant came through. Claire, Nolan, and a local evidence team searched the church storage room first. They found only scraps. A torn price tag from a stolen purse, a broken watch clasp, 2 empty tape rolls, and muddy tire grit near the rear door. Wesley had moved the larger items. The room smelled of dust, cardboard, old coffee, and beneath it all, the sharp trace Ronan had noticed: oil, damp blue wool, and cold lake air. Ronan worked slowly across the wooden floor, then stopped near the rear threshold and sat Claire crouched beside him. In the grooves of the floorboards was sand darker than ordinary road grit, mixed with a greenish fleck of dried lake weed. She called Ethan and described it. There was a pause. Then his voice changed. "North of town," he said. "Old Halverson boat landing. Caleb worked there after high school. Nobody uses it now except people who do not want to be seen." Claire looked across the storage room at Nolan, already calculating. "You know how to get there without using the main road?" "Yes. You will show us. You will not go alone." Another pause. Then, quieter. Understood. That single word mattered more than an argument won. Ethan had not surrendered his fear for Caleb. He had simply placed it where it would do less harm. That evening, in the small hospital room, Caleb slept with one hand resting on the blanket, the wooden box still missing from its proper place. Ethan stood by the window and watched old snow melt into silver lines across the parking lot. His phone lit with Claire's message, "Old boat landing. Morning." He stared at the words for a long while, then slipped the phone into the pocket nearest his heart. The warrant arrived just after midnight, when Duluth had gone quiet under a thin veil of lake fog. Wesley Crane's garage sat at the edge of town with its sign half, lit its windows dull, and its row of old vehicles crouched beneath tarps like animals pretending to sleep. The raid did not look like the kind of thing people imagined from television. There were no heroic shouts echoing through sparks and thunder. There was paperwork, marked vehicles, cold breath in the dark, and law enforcement officers moving with the sober patience of people who knew that one careless step could give a guilty man a gift. Claire Whitaker stood near the roll-up door with Ronan at her left side. The sable German shepherd was silent, his amber eyes fixed on the seam beneath the door, his body low and focused. Agent Nolan Pierce gave the signal. The door rose with a long metallic shriek that scraped through the night, like an old confession being forced into the open. Inside, the garage smelled of engine oil, stale coffee, cold rubber, and dust warmed by old machinery. A country station played softly from a radio near the back wall, the singer's voice thin and lonely under the buzz of fluorescent lights. Vehicles sat under gray tarps. Tool racks lined the walls. A red tool chest stood near the office door, the same one Ronan had watched 2 days earlier. Wesley Crane came from the small office buttoning his flannel shirt, his iron-gray hair combed badly now, his trimmed beard failing to make him look as harmless as it had in daylight. His face arranged itself quickly into insult. "You have got to be kidding me," he said. "Federal agents for a few stolen purses? Duluth must be safer than I thought." Claire did not answer the performance. She handed him a copy of the warrant. "Wesley Crane, we are executing a search warrant for this property, including vehicles, storage containers, office records, and tool compartments listed within the scope." Wesley looked at the paper as if it were an inconvenience, not a consequence. Nolan stepped in beside her, broad and steady, while 2 evidence technicians began photographing the first workbench. One technician, Marcy Quinn, was a compact woman in her 30s with copper-red hair, tucked beneath a knit cap, sharp green eyes, and the careful hands of someone who treated every small object like it might later speak in court. She gave Ronan a respectful glance, then returned to her camera without baby talk. Claire liked her immediately. Ronan's leash stayed loose. Claire gave him a quiet cue. He moved into the garage with slow precision, nose low but not frantic, passing shelves of filters, chains, spark plugs, and stained rags. Wesley folded his arms. "That dog going to accuse my toolbox now." Ronan stopped in front of the red tool chest. He sat not dramatic, not mystical, just certain. Claire looked at Nolan. Nolan looked at the warrant line, then at Marcy. "Open it." Wesley's mouth tightened. The top drawers held ordinary tools, sockets, screwdrivers, pliers, the kind of things any garage would have. Then Marcy opened the lower compartment. Inside lay a torn cash envelope, a woman's wallet with a church bake, sale receipts still folded inside, a silver watch identified from one of the earlier victims, several paper license plates, a bottle of firearm, cleaning oil, and 2 wrapped weapons. One had no visible serial number. The other matched the description of a stolen firearm from a neighboring county. Wesley's face did not change much, but his shoulders gave him away. They dropped half an inch, as if an invisible rope had finally gone slack. A single drop of old coffee fell from the rim of a forgotten mug onto the concrete. Tap. And in the sudden silence after it, even the radio seemed to hold its breath. Claire felt the room settle around that small sound. Evidence did not shout. It arrived quietly, then made escape impossible. Wesley started talking then, not confessing, just rearranging blame. He said young men came through sometimes. He said people left things. He said he was a mechanic, not a babysitter. Claire let him talk. Nolan read him his rights. Marcy photographed every item, labeled every bag, and sealed the weapons with the careful neutrality of law. Ethan Hale had been allowed to stand outside the main work area with another officer, far from the search itself. He was there only because Claire had permitted him to identify property belonging to Caleb if needed. He had obeyed the boundary, though. Every line of his body looked carved from restraint. Near the back corner, under a folded tarp and a box of used boat parts, Marcy uncovered a small wooden box. Dark wood, hand-carved lid. Worn edges. Ethan saw it before anyone said his name. His face went still. "That is Caleb's," he said quietly. Claire turned. She saw the box and understood at once that it was not valuable in the way thieves measured value. It was valuable in the way old photographs, a father's tools, and a house key could be valuable. It held a life together at the seams. Ethan did not reach for it. That mattered. He stood with his hands closed at his sides and let the law do what the law had to do. Claire spoke to Marcy. "Document it carefully. That item needs to return to the right hands." Ethan looked at her, and for 1 second the garage, Wesley, the tarps, the evidence bags, all of it moved to the edge of the world. He did not thank her, not aloud, but his eyes did, and Claire looked away first, because there were some forms of gratitude that were safer when left unnamed. Wesley was taken into custody before dawn, still insisting he was being made into a villain by people who needed a story. His phone and a grease-stained ledger from the office told a different one. There were names, partial payments, vehicle notes, and one entry circled twice. Landing before first light. Nolan leaned over the ledger. Old Halverson boat landing. Claire nodded. "They are moving what Wesley did not keep here." Nolan glanced toward Ethan. "He cannot be part of the arrest team." "He will not be," Claire said. "He can identify the access road and stay at the outer perimeter. Body armor, radio contact. Direct orders only." Ethan heard the terms and did not argue. That silence was not weakness. It was trust learning how to stand still. Before the convoy formed, Ethan returned to the hospital. Caleb was awake in the gray hour before morning, his face tired, his humor dimmed but not gone. Ethan pulled the chair close. "We found the box." Caleb turned his face toward the window. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic and weak coffee. "Dad will scold me for letting them take it." Ethan shook his head. "No, he will scold me for letting you fix that roof alone." Caleb's mouth lifted. "Good, then we are both in trouble." The laugh they shared was small, almost fragile, but it warmed the room more honestly than any heater. Outside the hospital, Claire waited beside her SUV, while Ronan stood with his front paws on the curb, sniffing the pre-dawn air as if reading a message written across the fog. Ethan approached and held out a worn seal challenge coin. It was dark bronze, rubbed smooth at the edges, heavy with years and things not said. "Return it when this is done," he said. Claire looked at the coin, then at him. "Then be there to receive it." Ronan pushed his muzzle between their hands and sniffed the coin with official seriousness. Ethan almost smiled. "Does he approve?" Claire slipped the coin into her jacket pocket. "He is reserving judgment." The vehicles left the hospital before sunrise. Claire rode in the lead SUV, the coin resting against her chest like a quiet promise. She refused to name. Ronan lay in the back seat, head against the window, eyes open and watchful. Behind them, Ethan sat with Nolan, looking toward the hidden shape of Lake Superior beyond the fog. No one said it aloud, but all of them understood the same truth. If they were one step too late, the young men who had frightened Caleb and the others would vanish before morning. The old Halverson boat landing waited in the gray hour before sunrise, half forgotten by the town and still remembered by the lake. It was not a hidden fortress or some grand criminal den. It was only a weather-beaten dock, a sagging warehouse, 2 abandoned boat trailers, and a narrow service road lined with pines that leaned inward as if listening. Cold water breathed against the shore. Dried lake grass clung to the mud. The air smelled of oil, wet wood, and the mineral chill of Lake Superior before morning. Claire Whitaker stood beside her SUV with Ronan at her knee, studying the landing through a pair of binoculars. The sable German shepherd was restless but controlled, his dark ears forward, his amber eyes fixed on the old repair truck parked near the warehouse. Behind Claire, Agent Nolan Pierce coordinated quietly with local officers, his broad frame still as a stone wall, his voice low over the radio. No one wanted noise. Noise gave frightened people permission to make foolish choices. Ethan Hale remained at the outer perimeter, exactly where Claire had placed him. He wore a borrowed vest over his dark jacket, a radio clipped near his shoulder, and the expression of a man who had accepted an order without liking it. From his position near the pine line, he could see the service road Caleb had once used when he worked at the landing after high school. Ethan remembered that road as a place of summer mornings, lunch pails, and Caleb laughing with dock workers who smelled of rope and diesel. Now it carried a different weight. The same stones, the same trees, the same strip of shore. But daylight had not yet arrived, and men with stolen property were trying to leave before it did. Ethan's hands stayed open at his sides. That was his victory for the moment, not reaching for a problem, just because his heart was burning. Near the warehouse, 4 young men moved quickly between a dented Kia and an old repair truck. They were not masterminds. They were nervous, young, and poorly led. The kind of men who had mistaken cruelty for courage because someone older had shown them how to profit from it. Trevor Mills was easy to spot. Lean, sharp-nosed, with restless hands and a blue hood pulled tight around his face. Another young man, heavier and shorter, kept looking toward the highway. A third carried a duffel with both hands as if it weighed more than money. The fourth stayed close to the truck's passenger side, eyes darting, shoulders tight. Claire watched them without anger. Anger could blur. She needed clarity. "Main road blocked," Nolan said quietly. "County unit has the highway cut off. No movement on the North Trail." Claire nodded. "Hold until we confirm the weapon's location." Ronan suddenly pulled away from the Kia, ignoring the strongest smell of cash and stolen items. Claire followed the leash's slight pressure. The dog angled toward the repair truck instead, nose close to the ground, then to the driver's side, then the rear floor panel. He stopped, sat, looked up at Claire. A gull cried above the landing, sharp and lonely, and the sound cut across the cold water, just as Ronan's paw touched the truck's rusted step. For one suspended second, every shadow seemed to hold its breath. Claire felt it then, the shift in the scene. The goods in the Kia were bait, or overflow. The repair truck was the heart of it. She signaled Nolan. Officers moved in with practiced restraint, not rushing, not shouting too soon. The young men looked up. Panic passed through them like wind through dry grass. Trevor dropped a bag. The heavier one bolted toward the side path. Ethan saw the direction before anyone else. That path curved toward a slick rock shelf above the water. Dangerous even in daylight, worse in morning fog. His body leaned forward by instinct. Then he stopped himself and keyed the radio. "North side runner is heading toward the wet rock ledge. Cut him off from the left, not straight behind. The ground drops there." Claire heard him. "Copy. Stay back." 2 local officers adjusted course and caught the runner before he reached the rocks. Ethan did not move. His jaw tightened, but he stayed where he was. Across the landing, Claire saw him through the fog and understood what that cost him. The fourth young man near the repair truck reached toward the open door, his hand diving low toward the hidden floor compartment. Ronan moved before Claire gave a second command. He surged forward with controlled power, not wild, not reckless, placing himself between the man and the truck. The man froze. It was only a moment, but moments are where lives sometimes turn. Nolan and another officer closed in and restrained him safely. Claire opened the floor compartment after the scene was secured. Inside were folded paper plates, envelopes of cash, a list of names and addresses, 2 wrapped firearms, and a small pouch of jewelry marked with initials from 3 different victims. The case, at last, had its shape in daylight. By sunrise, the young men were in custody. The stolen property was photographed and sealed. The firearm without a serial number and the one already reported stolen were documented carefully. The list of victims would support the broader charges. Lena Voss would still have to answer for her part, but her cooperation, her fear, and the information she provided had helped stop the pattern before another porch, another garage, another quiet person living alone became part of the story. Claire watched the evidence team work and felt Ronan press lightly against her leg. She looked down. "Good boy," she whispered. Ronan blinked once, as if accepting praise on behalf of destiny itself. A few days later, Caleb Hale sat upright in his hospital bed with more color in his face and less patience for medical supervision. Claire brought the wooden box back after it had been properly documented and cleared for return. Caleb took it with both hands. Inside lay his father's boatyard badge and the old photograph of 2 brothers by the dock. He did not weep loudly. He simply rested his palm on the lid for a long time, as if greeting someone who had traveled a hard road home. Ethan stood beside the bed, his face quiet. Caleb glanced from him to Claire. "She gives you orders better than I ever did," Ethan said. "She has a dog for backup." Outside the room, Ronan sat in the hallway under hospital rules, ears raised. He released one long breath that sounded remarkably like agreement.